A church bell, a missing priest, and a secret buried in Canterbury. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallow. Tell me where you're joining from. This community keeps growing thanks to you. It means so much to read your thoughts. Let's unravel it. If ever there was a case that defied my instincts and rattled even the edges of Poirot's famously ordered mind, it was what came to be known, rather poetically, I think, as the Canterbury Enigma. It was the summer of 1934. Poirot and I had just concluded a minor but curious matter involving a forged will in Lyon, and we were enjoying a rare spell of English sun at a charming hotel in the heart of Kent. The White Orchard Inn stood on the fringe of Canterbury, a grand old Georgian structure with lavender hedges and climbing ivy, its walls brimming with stories, many of which Poirot insisted were of no consequence to justice, mon ami. The inn, though small in staff, catered to a rather elite clientele. At the time of our stay, the guest list included Sir Reginald Darrington, a retired judge of some notoriety, Miss Olivia Vane, a celebrated contralto from the Royal Opera House, Dr. Ambrose Leclerc, a Canadian psychologist on a lecture tour, and Lady Millicent Grey, a wealthy widow from Devonshire, with a penchant for brandy at breakfast. Also of note was young Mr. Timothy Braithwaite, a quiet, scholarly man from Cambridge, who seemed to pass his days poring over ancient manuscripts and muttering Latin phrases to himself. He occupied the end room on the second floor, and while most found him peculiar, he was, by all accounts, a harmless academic. Then came the murder. It happened on a Thursday morning. The day began as usual. Poirot, in his usual pale grey suit and patent leather shoes, performing his egg symmetry ritual at breakfast, and myself enjoying a hearty plate of sausages. We were seated in the east-facing breakfast room when Mrs. Stanhope, the innkeeper's wife, came rushing in, her face a mask of alarm. "It's Mr. Braithwaite," she gasped, gripping the doorframe. He's not answering, and there's something strange. His door is locked from the inside." Now, this in itself might not have warranted alarm, but it was what followed that gave rise to the enigma. For when the door was forced open, by the gardener and Dr. Leclerc no less, they found Mr. Braithwaite slumped across his writing desk, dead. There was no sign of violence, no wound, no blood. His face bore no marks of pain or surprise. The room was in perfect order. The ink in his fountain pen had not even dried. Most curious of all, a single red bishop chess piece lay at the centre of the carpet, entirely out of place. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, his eyes narrowing. "This, Hastings, is no natural death." Dr. Leclerc, summoned immediately, confirmed the death, but was baffled by its cause. "No trauma, no external signs, perhaps a seizure," he offered. "But even that is—" Speculation. Poirot crouched by the desk, his fingertips barely grazing its edge. "And yet," he said softly, "everything is too tidy." Naturally, the authorities were summoned. Chief Inspector Howard from the Canterbury Police arrived within the hour, a man of sharp moustache and dull mind. He took statements, noted the locked door detail, and quickly concluded that Braithwaite had either succumbed to a health episode or taken something himself. Poirot, of course, said nothing. Not yet. That afternoon, Poirot and I stood outside the late Mr. Braithwaite's room as the constables conducted a cursory search. "It does not sit well, Hastings," he said. "This idea of a man dying quietly at his desk, with no sign of struggle, and yet a red bishop piece deliberately left as if to signal something." "No, it is arranged." "You think it was murder?" I asked, glancing about to be sure no one heard. Poirot tilted his head. "Murder is not merely the act, but the intention behind it. And this," he gestured to the doorframe, "feels theatrical." That evening, the inn was draped in a curious silence. The usual clink of cutlery at dinner was replaced by whispers. Lady Millicent excused herself early. Miss Vane appeared distracted, her plate barely touched. Sir Reginald drank more than was respectable, and Dr. Leclerc took to reading alone in the drawing-room, absently polishing his spectacles every few minutes. Poirot, meanwhile, seemed unusually reflective. He took no pudding, always a sign that his mind was fully occupied. Later, in our shared sitting-room, he brought out a small notebook and began sketching. "You see, Hastings," he said, tapping the page, "a red bishop is not a symbol that falls at random. It speaks of strategy, of calculation. One does not bring a chess piece into a man's room on accident." "Perhaps Braithwaite left it himself," I suggested. Poirot smiled. "That is possible, but improbable. Look closely at the room. No chessboard, no set. Why keep one piece? But why kill him at all? That, mon ami, is what we must discover. And to do so, we must begin not with the dead man, but with the living." And with that, Poirot closed his notebook with a snap and gazed out the window into the Canterbury twilight. "The game," he whispered, "has begun." Poirot rose early the next morning, immaculately dressed as ever, his moustaches waxed and gleaming, his tie knotted with geometric precision. I, still recovering from a rather restless night, disturbed not by dreams but by thoughts, was already seated by the window with the local paper when he emerged from his adjoining room. The inn felt colder somehow, as though the air had taken on the chill of unresolved things. He nodded at me, but said little, merely adjusting the cuffs of his shirt before motioning toward the corridor. "Come, Hastings, we shall begin." Begin what? I wasn't entirely sure, but I followed him. Nevertheless, Poirot had spoken the night before of understanding the living before the dead, and it seemed he now intended to put that maxim into action. The drawing-room was quiet when we entered, though a fire had been set to cut the morning chill. Sir Reginald Darrington was already seated in one of the leather armchairs, a copy of the Times trembling in his liver-spotted hands. When Poirot greeted him, the old judge looked up, eyes watery but sharp. "Morning, Mr. Poirot. Grim business, eh? That poor boy." Poirot gave a slight bow. "It is always grim, monsieur, when the human order is disrupted by violence or deceit. Might we speak?" "Speak? Oh, I suppose so," the judge said, folding his newspaper with exaggerated care. "Though I don't see what help I can be." Poirot nodded graciously. "It is only conversation, Sir Reginald, a habit most Englishmen enjoy with their toast." The judge allowed himself a wry smile. "Very well. Ask away." Poirot took a seat beside him, hands neatly folded in his lap. "You had, I believe, some acquaintance with Mr. Braithwaite." "Acquaintance is generous. The boy asked for my opinion on some obscure legal point last week, something about ecclesiastical law. Struck me as an odd fellow, but harmless." "And did he seem troubled? Distracted?" Darrington sniffed. "No more than any young scholar. Always scribbling, always muttering Latin. Bit of a recluse, but that's not a crime." "No, not at all," Poirot agreed. "You did not observe him in any disagreement with the other guests?" The judge hesitated, his brow creasing. "Now that you mention it, I did see him and that opera woman, Miss Vane, exchanging rather intense words by the hedge the day before yesterday. Couldn't hear what was said, of course. I assumed it was a lover's spat." Poirot's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Did they seem intimate?" Darrington laughed, a brittle sound. "Not in the slightest. She looked like she might throw her parasol at him." Poirot thanked him and stood. "Merci, monsieur. You have the clarity of a gavel." We made our way next to the breakfast-room, where Miss Olivia Vane sat alone, a single poached egg cooling on her plate. She was a striking woman in her 40s, with sharply painted lips and eyes that scanned the room like searchlights in the fog. Her expression grew guarded the moment she saw us. "I suppose you want to talk about poor Timothy," she said flatly. Poirot gave her a warm but neutral smile. "Only if you are willing, mademoiselle." She gestured to the chair across from her. Well, I've nothing to hide. Not like some people here. Indeed. Poirot tilted his head. And whom do you suspect of hiding? She laughed softly. Oh, it's not a matter of whom, Mr. Poirot. It's that everyone here is acting, as if they've all stepped into roles for a dinner theatre. The judge with his brooding silences, Lady Grey, fluttering about with invented grief, and that pompous psychologist, always writing in that little notebook of his. Poirot inclined his head. And you, mademoiselle? Did you know Mr. Braithwaite well? She stirred her tea. I met him 2 summers ago at a lecture in Oxford. He was brilliant. Awkward, yes, but brilliant. We exchanged letters. He thought he'd found something, a discovery of sorts. I didn't press for details, but he was quite obsessed. Poirot leaned forward. A discovery? What kind? Miss Vane hesitated. He didn't say, only that it had something to do with the church here in Canterbury. He was cryptic. I assumed it was just academic nonsense. Did he confide in you recently? She exhaled sharply. Not really. I tried to talk to him the day before yesterday. He was evasive, agitated even. Said I should leave, that things were moving too quickly. I told him not to be melodramatic. He said, it's not just about the manuscript anymore. That was the last real thing he said to me. Poirot's gaze remained fixed. And you were fond of him? Her voice caught slightly. I was. I still am, I suppose. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking. Non, mademoiselle. I think only of what does not yet fit. Merci. He rose gently, and we continued on. We encountered Lady Millicent Grey in the solarium, wrapped in a silken shawl despite the growing warmth. She greeted us with a small smile, her eyes weary. You'll want to ask about Timothy, she said. I can't say much. He wasn't very sociable. Poirot, always charming with women, took her hand lightly. You are too modest, madame. I am sure your grace touched even him. She gave a sad chuckle. Hardly, though he did speak to me once. 2 days ago, I believe. He asked if I knew anything about church archives. I told him my late husband had been a trustee at St. Agatha's, but beyond that, I was of no help. Poirot's eyes flicked upward. St. Agatha's, you say? She nodded. A strange little church, closed now, except on festival days. The roof collapsed years ago, but the records, my husband always said they were in terrible disorder. Timothy seemed very interested. Poirot absorbed this quietly. And did he mention why? Only that something had been buried, something dangerous. Poirot's brows lifted, but he asked no more. We thanked her and departed, both of us quieter now. Finally we turned to Dr. Leclerc, whom we found pacing the library, tapping a pencil against his chin. He looked up at our approach. Ah, Mr. Poirot. I was expecting you. Poirot clasped his hands together. Then you are a man who anticipates order, Doctor. A good quality. Leclerc smiled thinly. I believe in patterns, Monsieur Poirot. In the psychological framework that drives every person to act or not act. Bien. Then you will not mind my questions? On the contrary, I welcome them. Poirot sat opposite him. You examined Mr. Braithwaite's body. You found no natural cause? None that I could see. But then again, there are poisons that leave no trace. Certain neurotoxins, even some rare herbs. Did he seem distressed to you in the days before his death? Leclerc nodded. He was wound tight. I offered to speak with him, professionally. He declined. Said the mind was a minefield, not a map. Curious, Poirot murmured. And did you know of his interest in church records? Leclerc frowned. Only vaguely. He spoke of secrets, things that should not have endured. I assumed it was academic abstraction. Poirot rose. Perhaps, or perhaps something was found that others wished to remain hidden. Leclerc raised an eyebrow. "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect, Doctor," Poirot said with a smile, "that truth often wears a mask." As we stepped out into the hallway, the late morning sun streaming in through the stained glass window above the stairs, Poirot stopped suddenly. His gaze lingered on a small detail, barely noticeable. A single, faint scuff on the wooden floor, just outside Braithwaite's room. Circular, too small for a shoe, too precise to be incidental. Poirot knelt, examining it without touching. "Do you see, Hastings?" I peered closer. "A scratch?" "No, a placement." He straightened, eyes gleaming. A mark made by intention, not chaos. The game, it seemed, had advanced a move, and Poirot was already adjusting his pieces. Poirot stood motionless before that faint scuff mark, as though it held the final solution to the entire affair, his gaze so fixed that I feared he might have forgotten I was even present. The mark itself was no more than a faint indentation in the wood, but it clearly meant something to him. After a moment, he straightened slowly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Hastings," he said quietly, "do you know what is most interesting about this trace?" "That it exists at all," I ventured. He shook his head. "Number that it remains." In a place such as this, swept and polished by diligent hands, such a mark would not last long. It was made recently, perhaps even the day of the murder, and it suggests that something small and weighted rested here. But what? Not a heel, not a cane, something circular. He fell silent again, his eyes scanning the upper landing. A moment later, his expression softened, and he turned away from the mark, as if tucking the thought into some quiet corner of his mind. We descended the stairs to the reception alcove, where Mrs. Stanhope, the innkeeper's wife, stood rearranging a vase of tulips with more energy than was strictly required. Her cheeks were flushed, and she jumped slightly when Poirot greeted her. "Oh, Mr. Poirot, I didn't see you there. I'm terribly sorry. I've just been trying to keep the place looking respectable. It's all so dreadful, isn't it?" Poirot bowed slightly. "Indeed, madam. But it is in such times that order and dignity matter most, n'est-ce pas? Tell me, did Mr. Braithwaite ever request anything unusual from the staff? A delivery, perhaps? Or did he receive visitors not known to the other guests?" She bit her lip. "Not that I recall. He kept mostly to himself. Always polite, but quiet. Although—" Poirot leaned forward ever so slightly. "Yes, madame. Well, it may be nothing, but 2 nights before, just after dinner, I heard raised voices outside. I didn't see who it was, but someone said something like, 'You were warned,' in a very sharp tone. I thought it might have been Miss Vane or that judge. They all have such dramatic voices, but I wasn't certain." "And you heard this from where?" "From the hallway outside the linen cupboard. I was fetching towels. The voices were coming from the back lawn." Poirot offered a small nod. "Merci, madame. You have the ears of a hawk." With that, we stepped outside. The lawn behind the inn was immaculate, precisely trimmed, with rows of rose bushes and a gravel path that led to the orchard. A wrought iron bench sat beneath a flowering hawthorn, and near it a pair of overturned clay planters stood beside a gardener's trowel. Poirot paced the lawn slowly, his gaze distant. They met here, perhaps to speak in private, and someone with authority perhaps, issued a threat. I glanced around. The judge? Or Leclerc? "Possibly," Poirot murmured. "Or someone we have underestimated." We were interrupted by a low cough behind us. It was Howard, the local inspector, appearing awkward as ever in his stiff collar and expression of practised impatience. "Mr. Poirot," he said, "I've just come from the station. We've got Braithwaite's belongings laid out. Papers, letters, the usual. Thought you might like a look." Poirot smiled tightly. "How gracious of you, Inspector. I would be most grateful." We followed him down to the small constabulary office in town, where a locked drawer had been opened for Poirot's inspection. Inside were Braithwaite's personal effects, letters, 2 journals, a railway ticket stub, and a handful of scholarly notes. Poirot pored over them in silence, his fingers skimming each surface with a feather's touch. After some minutes he paused, holding a folded page with delicate care. "Hastings," he murmured. "Look at this." I leaned in. The paper bore a faded seal in red wax, an ecclesiastical crest with an inscription in Latin, "Veritas in silencio requiesci." "The truth rests in silence," Poirot translated aloud. Beneath the seal was a hastily scribbled line in Braithwaite's tight, angular hand. "Saint. Agatha's holds the bishop, but only the key will reveal the sanctuary." "What on earth does that mean?" I asked. Poirot's face was unreadable. "It means, mon ami, that the bishop, the Red Bishop, is not merely symbolic. It is literal. You think there's something hidden in that church?" Poirot nodded slowly. "I believe there is, and that Braithwaite found it, or was close to doing so. Back at the inn, the mood had changed. Word of Poirot's visit to the station must have circulated, for we found the guests more guarded, their expressions taut with barely veiled curiosity. Miss Vane avoided our eyes entirely. Dr. Leclerc appeared to have taken up residence near the liquor cabinet. Even Lady Millicent, usually all flutter and fuss, had turned pale and withdrawn. Poirot gathered us all in the drawing-room under the pretence of a simple discussion, though I could see the theatre in his eyes already. He was staging something. "My friends," he began, "I hope you will indulge me in a matter of logic. Consider, if you will, the concept of symmetry, not only in mathematics or art, but in human behaviour, the balance between motive and action, between concealment and confession." Lady Millicent looked around nervously. "Is this some sort of game, Mr. Poirot?" "No, madame. It is a method, a structure. We have here a death, timely for one, inconvenient for others, and inexplicable to all. A young man, a scholar, is found dead in a locked room, with a Red Bishop placed at his feet. No wound, no weapon, and yet he dies." Sir Reginald crossed his arms. "You think it was murder?" "I know it was murder," Poirot replied quietly, "and I believe that murder stemmed not from passion, but from preservation. Someone feared what Mr. Braithwaite was about to reveal." Dr. Leclerc chuckled dryly. "And what, may I ask, was he about to reveal?" Poirot's eyes glinted. "That remains to be seen, Doctor. But consider this. He spoke to Lady Millicent of church archives. He hinted to Miss Vane of a dangerous discovery. And he wrote of a key and a bishop. These are not the words of a man unravelling. They are the breadcrumbs of a mind deeply engaged." Olivia Vane stood abruptly. "I've had enough of this. If you're accusing me—" "I accuse no one, mademoiselle," Poirot said, calm as ever. "I only observe. But let me share one final thought before we rest. The Red Bishop, it is not random. It is a piece from a very specific chess set, and such a set, I believe, is owned by one of you." There was silence. Poirot turned to me as the guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Tomorrow, Hastings, we shall visit St. Agatha's. I believe the answer lies not with the corpse, but with what he left behind." And as we left the drawing-room, I could feel it in the air, that subtle shift, the tension of secrets not yet spoken. The next move, it seemed, was ours to make. The next morning dawned grey and restless. Clouds hung low over Canterbury, casting a pallid light across the inn's gardens and filling the air with the scent of damp stone and roses too early in bloom. Poirot was already awake, dressed in a navy suit with a pearl tie-pin, his shoes, as always, reflecting the ceiling. "Hastings," he said without turning from the window, "today we must chase a ghost, but not a ghost of superstition, a ghost of knowledge. Come, the church waits." He had arranged, with the help of Mrs. Stanhope's discreet local connections, for us to be granted access to St. Agatha's, closed to the public, abandoned in parts, and crumbling quietly just beyond the edge of the old town. We walked there in silence, Poirot unusually contemplative, his hands behind his back, and his brow lightly furrowed. St. Agatha's rose from the grass like a shipwreck. Its roof, as Lady Millicent had said, had collapsed over a decade earlier, but the nave and bell tower remained intact, framed by ivy and streaked with lichen. Rusted hinges groaned as we stepped inside. Dust danced in shafts of morning light. Broken pews leaned against one another like forgotten soldiers, and the scent of mildew clung to everything. Poirot did not hesitate. He moved through the main aisle slowly, eyes scanning every shadow, every stone. I followed closely, not entirely sure what we were looking for. "What exactly do you expect to find here?" I whispered, as our footsteps echoed softly. Poirot did not answer immediately. He came to a stop before the altar, chipped and half covered in moss, and turned slightly, peering to the left. "There," he said quietly. "Do you see that recess?" I looked. A small archway, half concealed behind a fallen tapestry, opened into a narrow stair descending into the undercroft. A faded plaque beside it read, "Sanctuarium." He stepped through it without hesitation, and we descended the stone steps carefully, one by one. The air below was cooler, and the walls glistened faintly with damp. We entered a chamber perhaps 20 feet wide, filled with cracked stone shelves and rotting wooden cabinets. Candles, long since extinguished, stood melted onto rusted iron sconces. Poirot moved straight to the far end of the room, where a square stone platform rose slightly from the floor. Carved into its face was the same ecclesiastical crest we had seen in Braithwaite's letter, the bishop's seal, and the words Veritas in silentio requiescit. He crouched beside it, his fingers brushing along the stone's edge. "This," he murmured, "is the sanctuary. And if I am not mistaken, beneath this very stone lies what Mr. Braithwaite sought." I crouched beside him. "But what is it?" Poirot straightened slowly. "Something that frightened him. Something he tried to warn us about, in fragments. But I think he was killed before he could decide what to do with it." I turned to inspect the nearby cabinets, many of which had splintered or collapsed. Most were filled with ancient ledgers, their ink faded, their bindings brittle. "Hastings," Poirot said sharply. I turned. He was standing over a second scuff mark, this one clearer, round, deliberate, nearly identical to the one outside Braithwaite's room. "It is not random," he said. "It is ritual. Someone placed an object here, something symbolic." "A red bishop," I said. "Oui," he whispered. "A warning, or a seal. Whoever killed him wanted us to come here and stop, to believe the trail ended with Braithwaite, but they did not account for one thing." I blinked. "What's that?" Poirot tapped his temple. "The little grey cells, mon ami." We returned to the inn just before noon. The others had gathered on the back terrace, as if summoned by something more than coincidence. Miss Vane stood by the balustrade, smoking nervously. Lady Millicent sat beneath the hawthorn tree, twisting a handkerchief in her lap. Dr. Leclerc was leafing through his notebook, though he scarcely turned the pages. Sir Reginald, arms crossed, stared fixedly at nothing. Poirot greeted them all with a slight bow, and asked, in that polite but unarguable voice of his, that they join us in the drawing-room once more. No one refused. Once seated, Poirot remained standing, hands clasped behind his back. "We have just returned from St. Agatha's," he began softly, "and there we found more than dust. We found echoes." He paced slowly across the rug, his tone calm but piercing. Timothy Braithwaite was a scholar. He sought not riches nor reputation, but truth, and in that pursuit he uncovered something hidden within the church, buried beneath the stones and cloaked in silence. No one spoke. Poirot's voice dropped further. But Mr. Braithwaite made a mistake. He underestimated how fiercely men guard the shadows in which they live. Dr. Leclerc shifted slightly in his seat. "If you have an accusation, Mr. Poirot, you should make it plainly." Poirot nodded. "In time. For now, I merely wish to illuminate." He turned to Sir Reginald. "Judge Darrington, you knew Braithwaite had discovered a legal discrepancy in the church's ownership records, did you not? You yourself warned him that pursuing it could threaten the endowment of St. Agatha's, something that might tarnish your legacy." The judge's jaw clenched. "He came to me for advice. I told him to tread carefully. That's all." Poirot turned next to Lady Millicent. "And you, madame, your late husband was one of the church's trustees. He spoke often of the quiet archives and of keeping certain donations off the books. Perhaps Mr. Braithwaite found financial irregularities, documents he intended to publish." Lady Millicent's lips trembled. "I didn't know. Not really. Only that Timothy was looking where he shouldn't." Poirot moved to Leclerc. "And you, Doctor, you fancy yourself an observer of men, but you missed something critical. You believed Braithwaite was breaking down. In truth, he was breaking through." Leclerc gave a cold laugh. "You sound like a dramatist, not a detective." Poirot smiled slightly. "Perhaps, but unlike the dramatist, I deal only in what can be proved." He stepped behind the sofa and lifted a small, cloth-wrapped object from the table. It had been waiting there when we returned, a parcel addressed to Poirot in a trembling hand. "I had this delivered from Braithwaite's solicitor this morning," he said. "A letter he instructed them to send in the event of his death." Gasps rippled across the room. Poirot unwrapped it with delicate fingers and drew out a small wooden chess piece, a red bishop, lacquered and old, worn at its base. "It is not random," he said again softly. He carried it, marked with wax, and beneath the bishop was a scrap of parchment, part of a confession, not his, someone else's, a page from the sanctuary's archives. He let the silence settle for a moment longer. Braithwaite found records implicating several prominent figures in fraudulent land acquisitions dating back to 1860. One name in particular appears again and again: transferred holdings, altered signatures, misappropriated trusts. It is a name that appears also in the letters Lady Millicent's husband stored in the church crypt. And that name," Poirot turned slowly, "is yours, Dr. Leclerc?" Leclerc stood abruptly. "That's preposterous. I've never—" "You were born Charles Leclerc, were you not?" Poirot said smoothly. "Before your change of name and academic reinvention. But your grandfather was among the trustees who signed those illegal deeds. And Braithwaite, clever, precise, and unfortunately tenacious, uncovered the connection." Leclerc's hands trembled now. "He was going to publish," Poirot said. "You knew it. And that night, after feigning friendship, you followed him, poisoned his drink, something rare and undetectable. Then you placed the bishop at his feet, a symbol meant to turn his discovery into a riddle no one would answer." "I didn't," Leclerc began, but his voice faltered. "I didn't mean to—" Poirot raised a hand. "Non, spare us the protest. The sanctuary held more than secrets. It held shame. And you, Doctor, could not allow the world to see it." Howard appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by the tension alone. "We've heard enough," he said grimly, stepping forward. "Dr. Leclerc, you'll come with me." Leclerc did not resist. He looked around once, at the judge, at Lady Millicent, at the broken light falling across the old wooden floor, and then lowered his gaze. Poirot watched in silence as he was led away. Only when the door had closed did he finally sit, folding his hands neatly in his lap. "You see, Hastings," he said quietly, "in the end, It was not the bishop that revealed the truth. It was the sanctuary of silence, and the man who dared disturb it. For a long while after Dr. Leclerc's quiet arrest, the drawing-room remained frozen in a kind of strained hush. The Red Bishop sat alone on the table, casting a faint shadow against the polished wood. No one spoke. Even the sounds from the garden, the breeze rustling the hedges, a blackbird's occasional cry, seemed distant, somehow muted beneath the weight of revelation. Poirot rose at last, smoothing the front of his jacket with a slow, deliberate motion. "It is not over," he said softly, almost to himself. "No, not yet." I turned to him, startled. "What do you mean, not over? Leclerc's confession was incomplete," Poirot interrupted. "And strategic." I blinked. Strategic? Poirot walked slowly to the window, gazing out over the lawn where the shadows of the hawthorn stretched like reaching fingers. "Did you not find it curious, Hastings, that Dr. Leclerc gave in so easily? No resistance, no denial beyond the perfunctory, and no attempt to deflect toward another." "Well, no," I admitted. "He was caught." "But a man like Leclerc," Poirot murmured, "a man whose life was built upon observation and control, does not relinquish it so passively. Non, mon ami. I believe he admitted only what he had to admit, enough to save himself from greater exposure." I felt a strange chill at that. "But the bishop, the poison—" Poirot turned sharply, eyes gleaming. "Yes, the bishop was placed by him. The method of death was his, but the motive, the root of it, is older, deeper. Leclerc was not the only one with something to lose. He was merely the hand that struck. There is still the matter of who persuaded that hand to act." I tried to marshal my thoughts. "Are you suggesting he was hired, or coerced?" Poirot said. "Or manipulated? Think, Hastings. Who among the others might have known about the old frauds at St. Agatha's? Who might have stood to lose not only reputation but wealth, should the truth be published?" I thought of Lady Millicent's pale face, her trembling hands, of Sir Reginald's granite stare, and then of Miss Vane, her anger, yes, but also her grief. "We must speak with them again," I said. Poirot gave the faintest of smiles. "Ah, finally you begin to sound like a detective." We found Lady Millicent in the library, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, though the room was warm. She looked up as we entered, eyes darting to the door, as if half expecting to be summoned next. "Mr. Poirot," she said faintly, "is it truly over?" Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Madame, I believe the storm has passed, but not the flood. Forgive me. There is still something I must ask you." She nodded, resigned. "Yes, of course. Your husband," Poirot began gently, "was more involved with St. Agatha's than you let on, was he not?" Her eyes filled suddenly with tears. He made mistakes, terrible ones. I only learned after his death. The misdirected funds, the land dealings. He thought no one would ever look that far back. And when Braithwaite came to you, I panicked," she said. "I warned him, gently, to leave it be. I didn't threaten him. I swear I didn't. I wanted to protect my husband's name." Poirot nodded slowly. "And what of the letters? The ones your husband kept hidden?" Her lips trembled. "I destroyed them. After the funeral. I thought it would be the end of it." "It never is," Poirot said softly. "Thank you, madame." We moved next to the terrace, where Sir Reginald sat rigidly, a tumbler of brandy in one hand, his jaw clenched as though he'd bitten through steel. "You've come to ask if I killed the boy," he said, not looking at us. Poirot remained silent for a beat. "Did you?" Sir Reginald drained his glass. But I'm not sorry he's dead." I drew a breath, but Poirot raised a finger, silencing me. "I warned him," the judge continued. "Warned him that digging into ecclesiastical matters would lead nowhere, that he'd make enemies. But he was arrogant. He thought his little thesis would shake the Church of England. "Did you know what he'd found?" Poirot asked. "Not precisely," Sir Reginald said, "only that it involved trustees from decades ago, and that he'd discovered names that mattered." "Yours?" The old man laughed bitterly. "Number, but men I once sat beside in chambers, men I admired." Poirot studied him a long moment. "And yet you said nothing when he died." Sir Reginald's voice dropped. "Because I knew. As soon as I saw the bishop, I knew. That church has been haunted by its own sins for too long. I thought it had finally claimed a penance." Poirot gave a curt nod. "Merci." We returned to the drawing room, the shadows now long across the floorboards. The bishop still sat where Poirot had left it. Miss Vane entered moments later, her face taut with fatigue. "I imagine I'm next," she said, sitting stiffly. Poirot studied her. "You knew him well." She exhaled. "I loved him once, but he was married to ideas, not people. That's why it didn't last. Yet, you followed him here." She met his gaze. "Because he told me he was afraid. He didn't say of whom, but he said he'd found something he couldn't unfind." "Did he mention Leclerc?" "No," she said, "but he did mention you, Mr. Poirot. He said if anything happened, you would understand." Poirot nodded slowly. And he was right. She looked away, her voice low. "I didn't want him to die." "I believe you, mademoiselle." Poirot stood, walked to the fireplace, and stared into the ashes. When he spoke again, his voice was grave. "There is something no one has asked yet, something vital. How did Leclerc get into Braithwaite's room when the door was locked from the inside?" I blinked. "Good Lord, yes. We never found the mechanism." Poirot turned to me, his eyes clear. "There was no mechanism," he said. "There was a duplicate key." He pulled a small, thin object from his coat pocket, a second brass key. "Found this beneath the flagstone in St. Agatha's Undercroft, wrapped in waxed paper, placed there after the murder." He turned to the room. Only one person knew both Braithwaite's routine and the layout of the inn. Only one person had the time to move freely without suspicion, and only one person had access to the key before the room was sealed. He pointed, not to the guests, but to the woman in the doorway, Mrs. Stanhope. She froze, a tray in her hands. "Mr. Poirot, I don't know what—" "You do," he said gently. "You helped him, didn't you? You opened the door, left it ajar for Leclerc, then locked it again afterward." Tears welled in her eyes. "He threatened me, said if I didn't help him, he'd ruin my husband. Said there were things in the accounts, tax records from years ago. I didn't want to, but I thought it was only to frighten the boy." Poirot approached her. "It was not your idea, but you enabled it, and now you must tell the truth." She nodded silently, then dropped the tray. It clattered on the floor like a gavel, and with it, the last secret of the Canterbury Enigma fell into place. Mrs. Stanhope stood frozen in the doorway, her face drained of colour, her hands trembling as the tray lay overturned at her feet. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint clink of a teacup rolling to rest against a leg of the piano. The others stared at her, but no one moved. Not Sir Reginald with his clenched jaw, nor Miss Vane, whose eyes shimmered with disbelief. Even Lady Millicent, seated near the window, seemed caught between sympathy and dread. Poirot remained composed. He stepped forward with quiet care, as though approaching a frightened animal. "Madame," he said, voice gentle, "we are no longer speaking of justice as vengeance. We are speaking of truth. It is a heavy thing to carry alone." She lowered her gaze. "He said it would be quick, that Timothy would just be frightened off, nothing more. But when I came back to lock the door, he was already slumped at the desk, dead." Poirot nodded. "And you said nothing. You played your part to protect your husband, your livelihood, perhaps even your own sense of order. But guilt, madame, it has its own key. It unlocks everything eventually." She didn't resist, as Poirot gestured to Inspector Howard, who had quietly entered during the confession. The inspector gave her a grave nod, then led her away without handcuffs, only a whisper of apology. The sound of her soft footsteps retreating into the corridor lingered longer than seemed natural. I turned to Poirot, my voice hushed. "Do you believe her?" He pressed his lips together. "She spoke the truth, but not the whole of it. There is still one move left to play, Hastings. One player who has not yet revealed themselves." I frowned. "But the killer was Leclerc. The accomplice was Mrs. Stanhope. What more is there?" Poirot's eyes flicked to the Red Bishop, still sitting solemnly on the table. "Think again, mon ami. Who placed the bishop in Braithwaite's room? We believed it was Leclerc, but he was a man of method, not symbolism. The bishop came from the sanctuary. It was a message, a warning, not to the victim, but to the others. You think someone else planted it? I think," Poirot said slowly, "that someone ensured it would be found, and that someone had a deeper investment in burying the truth. We must return to St. Agatha's." The sky had begun to darken by the time we reached the crumbling church once more. Evening light bled through the broken roof beams like pale fire. Inside, the air was still and reverent, as though even the dust dared not move without permission. Poirot led me past the main altar and down once again into the undercroft. We carried lanterns this time. The shadows seemed heavier. He moved without hesitation to the sanctuary stone, the one bearing the old crest and the Latin inscription. Kneeling beside it, he took a small tool from his pocket and began tracing the edge where it met the floor. "What are you looking for?" I asked, watching him with growing unease. "A second compartment," he murmured. "Leclerc found the first, the records, but he missed the rest. Braithwaite mentioned a key, not just to unlock a door, Hastings, to unlock a truth." There was a faint click as the stone shifted under his hand. Slowly he lifted it, revealing not more documents, but a small velvet pouch. Poirot opened it carefully and drew out a single object, a gold signet ring, emblazoned with the same crest as the bishop's seal. Poirot stared at it for a long moment. "This," he said softly, "belonged to the man who began it all, the one who orchestrated the land frauds, who sealed the illegal deeds and altered the ledgers, the man who vanished from the records just before the scandal could reach him." "And who was he?" I asked, stepping closer. Poirot looked up, his expression unreadable. "The Honourable Leonard Darrington." I felt the name like a blow. Sir Reginald's father? Oui. He stood, pocketing the ring. "Now you see why Braithwaite's death meant more than concealment. It meant legacy. Sir Reginald knew the truth. Perhaps he even feared exposure himself. But he let others do the dirty work, never directly involved, but always directing." "Do you believe he convinced Leclerc?" "I believe," Poirot said, leading the way back up the narrow stairs, "that Leclerc required little persuasion. A man trained in the psyche understands fear better than most. But Sir Reginald, he counted on that fear. He fed it. And Mrs. Stanhope? She was a useful thread in a fabric already fraying." When we returned to the inn, night had fallen. Lamps glowed low in the hallways, casting long shadows along the wooden panels. Poirot did not rest. He knocked firmly on the door to the judge's suite. After a pause, Sir Reginald opened it, still in evening wear, a decanter in one hand. "I wondered when you'd come." Poirot walked past him without waiting for permission. "You knew your father was at the heart of the old corruption, and when Braithwaite got close to exposing it, you found others to intervene. Not directly, not obviously, but enough to silence him." The judge set the decanter down. "You're accusing me of manipulation?" "I accuse you of cowardice," Poirot said quietly, "of standing behind your reputation like a shield while others committed murder to protect your name. Sir Reginald's mouth twitched, a hard line forming. You cannot prove that I ordered anything. No, Poirot agreed, but I can prove you concealed the truth after the fact. You received a letter from Braithwaite the night he died, a plea, and you burned it. Sir Reginald's fingers curled into fists. I had to. Poirot stepped closer. You thought the bishop would be seen as the mark of a fanatic. You thought we would chase ghosts. But it was not a ghost. It was your father. There was a long silence. Sir Reginald looked away, eyes gleaming with unshed fury. He was a monster, a respected man, a fraud. I've spent my whole life trying to be what he wasn't. Then why protect him? I asked. His voice cracked. Because if I didn't, the name would die with him, and I'd die with the name. Poirot nodded slowly. And so Braithwaite died instead. Howard entered the room moments later, summoned by Poirot's earlier call. He did not arrest Sir Reginald. There were no formal charges, but the judge did not return to London. His resignation followed within the week, quietly, without ceremony. The Canterbury Enigma, as the newspapers later called it, faded into the folds of history with a final whisper. Leclerc was tried and sentenced. Mrs. Stanhope's testimony spared her prison, though she left the inn and was never heard from again. Olivia Vane returned to her opera house. Her next performance, I am told, was hauntingly mournful. As for Poirot, he said little in the days that followed. We left Canterbury in the same soft light in which we had arrived, the air thick with the scent of rain and lilac. On the train, I asked him the question that had sat in my chest since the beginning. Poirot, did Braithwaite know he would be killed? Poirot turned his gaze to the passing countryside, his voice low and certain. He knew Hastings. That's why he wrote to me. That's why he left the bishop. Not as a message for his killer, but for me. So I would finish what he could not. And with that, he closed his eyes and folded his hands. The train rolled on, and the truth at last had found its home. The train hummed steadily beneath us, a comforting rhythm that might have lulled another man into drowsy forgetfulness, but not Poirot. Though his eyes remained closed, I could see in the subtle tension of his brow that his mind was still turning, methodical, exacting, far from finished. He had drawn a neat handkerchief across his lap, his fingers idly smoothing out imaginary creases, yet the stillness around him was deceptive. I hesitated before speaking. The case had concluded publicly, Leclerc imprisoned, the inn cleared of guests, Sir Reginald quietly retired, but Poirot had not yet offered his usual reflection. No philosophical summary, no triumphant distillation of human folly, and that, perhaps more than anything, told me something still disturbed him. You don't believe it's truly over, I said quietly. He opened his eyes. No, Hastings. It is over in the sense that justice has been served according to the law, but human justice, that is another matter. The soul does not rest simply because the court has closed its books. I leaned back into the worn upholstery of our compartment, the words hanging in the space between us. Do you still think someone else was involved? Poirot shook his head. Non, not in the physical act. The death of Mr. Braithwaite was orchestrated by Leclerc, enabled by Mrs. Stanhope, and morally neglected by Sir Reginald. The threads of guilt have been traced. But Hastings, what troubles me is the deliberate nature of it all. He reached into his coat and withdrew the red bishop again, holding it in the flat of his palm. Consider this. Braithwaite was a man of logic, of language, of codes. He understood symbols. For him to leave this, so conspicuously placed, it was not merely a warning. It was a cipher, an accusation, yes, but also an invitation. An invitation? I repeated. Poirot nodded. To understand him, to see the connections he saw, You remember the phrase he wrote, "St. Agatha's holds the bishop, but only the key will reveal the sanctuary." "Yes," I said. "And you found the key beneath the sanctuary stone." "I found a key, Hastings, but not the key, not in the way Braithwaite meant. He spoke of revelation, not of locks, of sanctuary, not merely as a place, but as a truth that had been hidden and needed to be restored." I frowned, trying to follow his meaning. "You think there was more to the documents in the Undercroft?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Precisely. I have sent them to a trusted archivist at the Bodleian. Already they have uncovered discrepancies in the signatures, names forged across decades to preserve a false ownership of church lands. Braithwaite's thesis was not simply academic. It was, in its own way, revolutionary. Had he lived to publish, it would have shaken the diocese, and yet it would not have restored anything." He paused, fingers tightening slightly around the bishop. "There is something profoundly sad in that." I looked at him. "You admire him." "I do," Poirot said simply. "He died for something larger than himself. And though he died afraid, he did not die silent. He left a trail, not of vengeance, but of understanding." We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the gentle rhythm of wheels on rails. I watched the countryside blur past, green fields melting into clusters of trees, low stone walls cutting across the land like scars. It all felt distant, removed, as though the entire world had shifted slightly while we were in Canterbury, and we were returning not to London, but to something altogether different. Poirot stirred suddenly. "You recall, Hastings, the faint scuff outside Braithwaite's door, and again in the sanctuary?" "Of course. They were the first real clues, weren't they?" "Indeed, but they were also deliberate, planted." I turned to him, surprised. "Planted? By Leclerc?" Poirot shook his head. "Number by Braithwaite himself." The idea seemed impossible at first, and then curiously inevitable. "You mean he knew someone would come for him?" "He feared it, but more importantly, he prepared for it. Those scuff marks, they matched precisely the size of the bishop's base. He placed the piece there days before. He rehearsed it, Hastings. He laid the scene." "But why?" Poirot's voice softened. "Because he understood that his work was dangerous, that his discovery would make him a target. And so he created a mystery around it, something that could not be buried with him, something that would draw out someone like me." He turned the bishop slowly in his fingers. "A man may be silenced, but a puzzle, that cannot be ignored." I felt a curious shiver run through me. So even his death was part of the message. Poirot inclined his head. Braithwaite's genius was not only in what he found, but in how he ensured it would not be lost. He baited the trap for his own murderer, but also planted seeds for justice. Even at the cost of his life. Especially at the cost of his life. The train whistle blew, distant and mournful, as we neared the outskirts of London. Poirot returned the bishop to its pouch, folding it carefully and placing it back inside his coat. "There are few who understand the weight of quiet conviction," he said. "Most men shout their truths. Braithwaite whispered his, and still it was heard. When we arrived at Victoria Station, the bustle of city life seemed almost jarring. Porters shouting, engines hissing, cab wheels clattering on the wet street. It was all too loud, too fast, after the solemn unravelling of Canterbury's secrets. As we stepped into the crowd, Poirot paused once more. "You will write about this, I think," he said. "I will," I said. "But I'll never do it justice." Poirot gave a small smile. "Then at least do it honestly. Leave in the silences, the parts that do not quite make sense. That, Hastings, is where the real story lives." We parted ways shortly after, Poirot to his apartment, and I to mine, each of us returning to lives that now seemed thinner somehow, stretched by the knowledge of what we had uncovered, That night, as I sat at my desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper, I thought again of the Red Bishop, of the stone sanctuary, of Braithwaite, hunched at his desk, pen in hand, laying out his final message, and of Poirot, resolute, meticulous, patient to the end, gathering the broken fragments and arranging them with the precision of a master player. A mystery had been solved, a truth had been restored. But more than anything, a whisper had been heard, and it was enough. Days passed after our return to London, and with each one, the affair at Canterbury receded further into the shadows of public attention. Newspapers printed their versions, trimmed, factual, politely sanitized. Leclerc's arrest had become a brief footnote in the broader discourse of criminal psychology. Mrs. Stanhope's involvement was mentioned only in vague, hushed tones. Sir Reginald's resignation was presented with the usual euphemisms: ill health, personal reasons, graceful retirement. No mention of the Red Bishop, no mention of the sanctuary beneath the ruined church. But for Poirot, the case had not settled so quietly. There was something that continued to occupy his mind, something small, invisible perhaps to others, but no less significant to him. I noticed it in the way he handled his morning toast with less enthusiasm, how he paced his flat with a kind of unspoken rhythm, and most telling of all, how he kept the bishop sealed away in the centre drawer of his desk, neither displayed nor discarded. One afternoon, some 10 days after our return, I visited him on a quiet whim. The sky was iron grey, and a steady drizzle tapped against the windows like an insistent memory. Poirot received me in his drawing-room with his usual courtesy, though I sensed immediately that I had interrupted something. Papers were scattered across his desk, a map of Canterbury unfurled and marked with lines in red ink. A photograph of the sanctuary stone, carefully annotated in his hand, lay beside a half-empty teacup. "You're still thinking about Braithwaite," I said gently, removing my hat. Poirot gestured to the chair by the hearth. "Assieds toi, mon ami. You are correct. There is something still unresolved." I leaned forward, curious now. "But surely the case is closed, the perpetrators identified. Justice, however delayed, was served." Poirot tilted his head. "You speak as though the mystery is only the murder, but that was merely the climax. No, Hastings, the true mystery was always what Braithwaite found, what he meant to reveal. The confession beneath the bishop was incomplete, a fragment of a larger document. The records he had recovered, many were damaged beyond restoration. But his final notes, the references he made, they suggest something more." "More?" I asked. "I thought it was a land fraud." Poirot leaned back, lacing his fingers. "It was, initially, a misappropriation of endowment land, illegal trusts set up to benefit silent partners. But in Braithwaite's last entries, he makes mention of something buried, not just symbolically, physically buried." I stared at him. "You think there's something still hidden in the sanctuary?" "I think Braithwaite believed so. And more to the point, I believe someone else did too." He stood abruptly, crossing to a locked drawer and removing a folded sheet. He handed it to me with a gravity that pulled the room tighter. It was a letter, one I had not seen before, dated 3 days before Braithwaite's death. "Dear Mr. Poirot, if you are reading this, then I fear the danger I once dismissed as mere tension has taken root. I am close now, very close, but I no longer trust those around me. Someone has been watching me near the church ruins. I have seen footprints, oddly placed, deliberate, as though someone were trying to let me see without being seen. I believe the bishop is more than a symbol. I believe it is a marker, an old one. Beneath the sanctuary there is something else. I have not found it, but I know it is there, and I know now that I may not live to confirm it. Do not trust the easy solution. Look deeper, always deeper. Timothy Braithwaite." I folded the page slowly. He was afraid. Poirot nodded, but also resolute. He did not stop looking, and now neither shall I. The next morning we boarded the earliest train back to Canterbury, Poirot unusually quiet throughout the journey. He barely glanced at his newspaper, and when he did speak, it was only to murmur some recollection of Braithwaite's wording. The bishop is more than a symbol, a marker, deliberate footprints. We arrived beneath a sky bruised with clouds and walked briskly to St. Agatha's. The ruins had not changed, nor had the silence that clung to the undercroft. Poirot led the way down the narrow steps, lantern in hand, his every movement precise. He stopped before the sanctuary stone again, knelt, and inspected the seam. Then, instead of lifting it, he turned his attention to the surrounding wall, particularly to a narrow crevice just to the right of the crest. "There," he whispered. "Do you see it?" I squinted. "See what?" He took a small brush from his pocket and swept the dust away. A faint carving appeared, almost invisible to the eye, a cross intersected by a tiny circle. Not a letter, not a symbol I recognized, but old, worn, etched deeply into the stone. "It's not just decoration," Poirot said. "It's a boundary." He pressed both hands flat to the wall and gave a slight push. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a faint grind of stone on stone, the slab shuddered inward by a fraction of an inch. He stepped back. A breath of air escaped from within. Behind the false wall was a cavity, no more than a foot wide, but deep. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and still remarkably intact, was a cylindrical metal canister. Poirot withdrew it gently and set it down on the cold stone. With delicate hands, he peeled back the covering and unsealed the lid. Inside were pages, parchment, not paper, handwritten in ink so dark it had barely faded. A journal. We examined it together by the glow of the lantern, our breath visible in the cold. The script was old-fashioned, looping, unmistakably clerical. It bore a name at the top, Frater Aidan, 1847. What followed was a confession, meticulous and astonishing. Aidan had been a cleric and the original keeper of the church records, but he had discovered that his fellow trustees, under the guise of religious patronage, were stealing land. The documents were forged, the funds misdirected, and when Aidan threatened to expose them, they arranged for his removal from office. Fearing for his life, he did what Braithwaite would do nearly a century later. He preserved the truth. He buried it in the sanctuary behind false walls, marked the space with the bishop, a piece from a chess set he kept as a child. The bishop, Aidan wrote, was his symbol of conscience, his silent guardian. The final page was simple, aching with resolve. "I may be forgotten, but he shall stand, in red, in silence, until someone sees." We sat for a long moment, the gravity of it all weighing heavily. Poirot touched the last line with 2 fingers, then closed the journal. "Braithwaite never found this," I said. "No," Poirot replied softly, "but he felt it. He was not wrong. He was merely early." He stood, straightening his coat, and gazed at the sealed alcove one last time. "We shall send this to the diocese," he said. "It may ruin reputations long buried, but that is not our concern." As we emerged into the grey light of afternoon, the wind stirred faintly through the long grass, lifting the ivy from the stone like fingers letting go. I looked back at the church, its crumbling frame still towering despite its wounds. "You know," I said, "in the end, Braithwaite didn't just uncover corruption, he resurrected a man." Poirot smiled. "Oui, Hastings, 2 men, Frater Aidan and himself, and though the Red Bishop would remain a symbol forever tied to death and secrecy, I could not help but see it differently then, not as a warning, but as a beacon, a flame left burning in the dark, waiting for someone to come and notice." We returned from the sanctuary, with the journal carefully wrapped and sealed, our hands still chilled from the undercroft's breath, and our minds, though burdened with solemnity, strangely lightened. The canister now rested in Poirot's satchel, like a sacred relic, more precious than gold. As we walked through the churchyard, the sky broke briefly above us, and a ray of pale sun struck the weathered stone cross that marked the edge of the ruins. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Only once we reached the small lane beyond the orchard, with Canterbury's rooftops reappearing ahead, did Poirot finally speak. "You see now, Hastings," he said quietly. "This case was never about murder alone. It was about preservation, the lengths to which men will go to conceal disgrace, and the rarer lengths to which others will go to restore lost truth." I nodded, still trying to process it all. It feels strange, doesn't it, that the death of one quiet academic could be the key to something buried for almost a century. Poirot gave a small smile. Strange, yes, but not illogical. Truth, like the good bishop himself, does not rot in the dark. It merely waits for the light. We returned to the White Orchard Inn one last time, not for further investigation, but to speak with someone who, we now believed, had carried a second burden all along, Olivia Vane. She had not left Canterbury after the inquiry, choosing instead to extend her stay in the quiet solitude of the Kentish countryside. We found her seated in the rose garden, wrapped in a grey shawl, her fingers clutching a closed book, as if it were the last tether to something lost. She looked up as we approached and gave us a look that was not quite wary, not quite welcoming, somewhere in between, heavy with unresolved grief. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked softly. Poirot nodded and sat beside her. "Yes, mademoiselle. We found what Timothy sought." She looked down. "He told me once that knowledge was a kind of cathedral, not something you stand outside and admire, but something you walk into and get lost in. I didn't understand it then." "He was right," Poirot said gently, "and like a cathedral, it must have foundations. His were built on conscience." She nodded, blinking rapidly. "He always said he felt watched, but not by his enemies, by time itself. He felt behind, like he was trying to make up for someone else's silence." "In a way," Poirot murmured, "he was." Olivia's voice dropped. "And what now? What happens to it?" Poirot reached into his satchel and handed her a copy he'd had made of the final page of Aidan's journal. "The diocese will receive the original, and perhaps in time the public will too. But for now, we thought you might want to see the words your friend died to uncover." She read it once, just once, and then folded the page in her lap, her shoulders rising and falling in the rhythm of quiet, invisible grief. "He was never meant to die in that room. He was meant to speak in a hall full of people." Poirot stood. "And now he will, mademoiselle, just not in the way he imagined." We left her there, sitting with the copy, the shawl tight around her shoulders, the roses just beginning to tremble in the evening breeze, and though she did not speak again, I saw her lips move as we departed. A thank you, I think, or perhaps simply a prayer. That evening, Poirot and I dined together in a quiet corner of the King's Arms, our meal modest and unremarkable, though Poirot, as always, had opinions on the cut of the beans and the flour used in the bread. But his mind, I could tell, remained elsewhere. After dessert, he looked out the window toward the spire of the cathedral in the distance and said, "I find that I am not as interested in the guilty as I once was, Hastings. Or rather, not in their punishment. I am more interested in how their crimes distort the truth of others. That, I think, is the greater tragedy." "And Braithwaite?" I asked. "Do you think he knew he'd done enough?" Poirot's gaze didn't shift. "I believe he hoped. And hope, mon ami, is the one flame that burns even in the deepest catacombs." Later, as we prepared to leave for the final time, Poirot paused at the threshold of the inn. He turned once more to look down the hallway, now silent, the wallpaper faded, the air empty of menace. The door to Braithwaite's room was closed again, freshly painted, the number rebrushed in gold. "He did not die alone," Poirot said, "even if he thought he would. He left a map, Hastings, and we followed it." We took the evening train back to London in silence, though this time the quiet was different, less burdened, more contemplative. I glanced across at Poirot more than once, waiting for one of his usual closing remarks, but he merely sat with his hands in his lap, eyes fixed on the moving landscape beyond the window. As we passed through Ashford, he spoke again, softly. "You know, Hastings, it is a curious thing. We spend so much of our time chasing lies, examining the masks people wear, but every once in a while someone leaves us the truth. Not loudly, not boldly, but in symbols, in shadows, in silence." He turned to me then, his eyes tired but still alert. "That is the great privilege of what we do, to listen to those voices that others have chosen to forget." I nodded, unable to answer. The words sat with me the rest of the ride. When we reached London, I offered to accompany him to Whitehaven Mansions, but he declined gently. "You must go home to your dear wife, mon ami. She worries when you disappear with me." "And you?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "I have tea to make, and a bishop to return to its rightful place." As he disappeared into the cab, coat collar turned up against the wind, I watched him for a long moment, before stepping into the crowd. Something in me felt different, more awake, more reverent, as though I had glimpsed something sacred and quietly been asked to keep it safe. That night before bed, I laid out a single page in my notebook. At the top I wrote, "The Canterbury Enigma." Below, I wrote only one sentence. It began with a red bishop and ended with a voice no longer forgotten, and somehow I knew it would be enough. A week passed, then two. London moved forward, as it always does, with indifferent speed. The case no longer featured in the papers. The public had moved on to a robbery in Mayfair and a scandal involving a member of Parliament. Yet for Poirot, the Red Bishop had not yet been returned to its resting place. Not in his mind, and certainly not in the lacquered drawer of his desk, where it now lay beneath a folded square of silk. I found myself thinking of it often too, of Braithwaite, of that silent sanctuary beneath the ruined church, and most of all, of the eerie, weightless power of a mystery that extended far beyond the mere mechanics of a crime. It was a feeling not easily explained, a kind of ache, not for justice, but for the quiet men history almost forgot. When I next visited Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot greeted me in a manner that told me he had not let the matter go. He was dressed immaculately, as ever, but a familiar glint had returned to his eye, the one that usually meant something had been troubling him, and he'd finally understood it. "Hastings," he said, ushering me inside, "you have come at the perfect moment." I smiled cautiously. That usually means I'm about to be taken on another wild journey. He gave an elegant shrug. "But, of course, and yet this one shall require no train, no umbrella, and no discomfort to your good shoes. Only patience, and perhaps perspective." I sat down while he retrieved a slender envelope from a stack beside his breakfast tray. He opened it with delicate precision and slid out a single card. It was handwritten in fine, looping script. "Mr. Hercule Poirot, should you still have questions regarding the late Mr. Braithwaite's work, I would be willing to speak with you. There are matters left unspoken, and I do not wish to carry them alone. Father Elias Harcourt, Archivist Emeritus, Diocese of Canterbury." I raised my eyebrows. "He contacted you?" "Oui, unsolicited, and just in time, because I believe the final piece of this matter lies not in the church, nor in the records, nor even in Braithwaite's notes. It lies with a man who chose silence for too long." We arranged the meeting for the following afternoon at Father Elias's residence, a small stone cottage tucked behind the garden walls of St. Anselm's Seminary, just east of the cathedral precinct. It was a place removed from the world, not by distance, but by intention. Every hedge had been trimmed to humility. Every door creaked softly, as if to excuse its own presence. Father Elias greeted us at the threshold, a thin, white-bearded man whose eyes, though sunken, remained impossibly sharp. He did not smile, but there was no coldness in his manner, only gravity. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings, come. There is little ceremony left in me, but I offer you tea." We declined the tea, and he led us to a small study that smelled of camphor and brittle paper. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with volumes too worn to stand upright. In the center of the room, beneath a single oil lamp, sat a carved wooden box. "I saw the name Braithwaite in the paper," he began, lowering himself into a chair with effort. "It stirred memories I had buried with discipline. But time plays its own games, does it not?" Poirot folded his hands. "You knew him. I knew of him. He wrote to me last year requesting access to records long since sealed. I was no longer permitted to grant them, and truth be told, I was relieved to have an excuse. The records he sought were dangerous." "Because they implicated your predecessors?" I asked. Father Elias looked at me with a shadow of reproach. "Because they implicated all of us, in one way or another. The diocese is not only a religious body, Captain. It is an estate, an institution. When one block of its foundation begins to rot, the entire edifice quivers. Braithwaite's questions shook dust from corners I had spent 40 years keeping undisturbed. And yet," Poirot said quietly, "you have invited us here now." The old man's eyes lowered, "Because I saw how he died, because I recognized the bishop, and because the time for silence is over." He lifted the box's lid and took out a leather-bound folio. Its spine was cracked, and a faint cross was embossed in the center, so faint it could barely be seen unless the light caught it directly. "These," he said, "are the unarchived records of Frater Aidan, the ones Braithwaite did not find, the ones I kept." Poirot reached forward reverently, as if receiving communion. "They confirm what Braithwaite suspected," Father Elias continued. "The land thefts, yes, the altered deeds, but also the reason they were hidden so carefully. The properties were not simply sold. They were laundered through a fictitious trust tied to a single name." He opened the folio to the final page and pointed. "I, Leonard Darrington, do solemnly swear." I exhaled slowly. "Sir Reginald's father." Father Elias nodded. "He was not just a signatory. He created the system. The bishop? It was his sigil, not Frater Aidan's. Aidan appropriated it, turned the mark of crime into one of conscience." Poirot stared down at the signature. The cycle reversed, the mark redefined. "Until Braithwaite came," the old priest said, "and reminded us which meaning was true." There was silence in the room then, profound and almost sacred. Poirot closed the folio carefully and returned it to the box. "Father," he said softly, "what will you do with this?" Elias looked out the window, where the wind had stirred the ivy on the wall. "I will not burn it. That, at least, I have decided. The rest, I do not know, but perhaps the burden does not belong to me any more." Poirot inclined his head. "Number it belongs to history." As we left, the old man did not follow us to the door. He remained seated, the box before him, the past finally unpacked, and I do not think he felt lighter, only more honest. The train back to London that evening was quiet. Poirot said very little until we reached the station, and even then, his good night was brief. But as we parted ways, he handed me something, an envelope containing a copy of the last page from the folio. Below the Darrington signature, Father Elias had written a note in his own hand. "Legacy is not built by silence. Let the truth echo louder than the lie." That night, I placed it beside Braithwaite's own final words in my journal, and for the first time, I felt the story had truly ended. The morning was bright, unexpectedly so, the kind of crisp, clear London morning that seems designed to close a chapter, to tidy loose threads with a nod from nature herself. I walked to Whitehaven Mansions with that peculiar mixture of warmth and melancholy one feels at the end of a long tale, unsure whether to be grateful it's over or sad that it must end. Poirot was already dressed when I arrived, seated by the window in a dove-grey suit, a small white orchid pinned delicately to his lapel. He rose at once and offered me a seat, the red bishop no longer on his desk, but replaced by a single white pawn, an oddly poetic touch I did not fail to notice. "You are wondering where it has gone," he said, eyes twinkling. "The bishop." "I am," I admitted. "You didn't return it to the diocese, did you?" "Non," he replied. "It has gone to someone who understood it best. Miss Vane. She will place it on Braithwaite's grave, she says, as a kind of vigil." I nodded, moved in a way I had not expected. "It's fitting." Poirot leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Indeed. And so, Hastings, we come to the true end, not of a case, but of an enigma." "The Canterbury Enigma," I said, "though I feel we solved more than one." "Three, in fact," he said. "Shall I enumerate them?" I smiled. "I think you'd be disappointed if you didn't." Poirot raised a finger. "First, the mystery of the locked-room death. This was Leclerc's doing, a precise and calculated poisoning, arranged to mimic an academic's natural collapse. He manipulated Mrs. Stanhope through fear, used her access to secure a window of opportunity, and locked the door to create confusion. But it was never truly about how Braithwaite died. It was about why." He raised a second finger. "Second, the identity of the true mastermind. Not Leclerc, but Sir Reginald, who understood all too well the implications of his father's name being exposed. He did not commit the murder, but he planted the seeds, knowing full well how quickly fear would ripen in the minds of others." Then he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, as he lifted a third finger. "And third, perhaps the most intricate enigma of all, the purpose of the Red Bishop, a symbol that travelled through time. It was used first to signify guilt, then reclaimed to protect the truth, and finally offered by Braithwaite as both a riddle and a call to arms. That, Hastings, was the true brilliance of the case. Not the mechanics of crime, but the transformation of meaning. The bishop became not a piece of a game, but the voice of justice long silenced." He let his hand fall slowly to the arm of his chair. "And we, mon ami, we listened." There was a long moment where I could find nothing to say. The weight of all we discovered, the corruption, the confessions, the whispered names in forgotten ledgers, settled not as a burden, but as a kind of quiet clarity. Poirot stood and crossed to the window, gazing out at the street below. "I have always believed," he said, "that evil is not only found in the grand gestures. It resides in hesitation, in the silences we maintain to preserve comfort. Sir Reginald preserved his father's legacy. Father Elias protected his institution. Even Mrs. Stanhope, poor creature, preserved her fragile peace. But Braithwaite? He disrupted. He questioned. And though it cost him dearly, he gave us all a chance to choose differently." "And you," I said. "You gave him a voice." Poirot turned and offered a small bow. "It is not a detective's highest achievement to solve a murder, Hastings. It is to understand a man before the world forgets him. We shared a final glass of tea that morning, and though no case followed immediately, I had the sense that Poirot was more at ease than he had been in weeks. He no longer traced invisible patterns on the carpet with his cane, nor rearranged his cutlery with military precision. Something had been settled, not only for Braithwaite, but within himself. As I took my leave, he walked with me to the door, pausing just before I stepped into the corridor. "You will write it, yes?" he asked. "Of course." He smiled. "Then remember, mon ami, tell them not how it ended, but how it endured. The Red Bishop, the truth, the man, and then, with a gentle click of the latch, he was gone. That night I wrote deep into the evening, and when I finished, I added one final note, small, centred, in Braithwaite's own phrasing. The sanctuary was never the church. It was the truth he buried beneath it, and it had finally been unearthed.